This lecture is going to focus on Rabbinic Judaism, which replaced the temple-centered practices that dominated in the early period of Judaism. When there was a temple, you could transfer your sins to an animal and bring it to the temple and have a priest make a sacrifice to God. And as they would put it on a fire in the Holy of Holies, this altar at the center of this massive temple in Jerusalem, and your sins would be consumed by the fire, and therefore you could deal with sin in that way. In 70 CE, however, the Romans destroyed the temple, and that meant that there was no longer any way to deal with sin. And this really forced Jews to rethink the whole issue about, what does it mean to be in the world, and what is our purpose, and how do we deal with sin, and what do we do if we can't worship in the temple? And so the rabbis, or teachers, who had already existed in the earlier period, but they really came to define Judaism as they still do today. So a rabbi is not a priest. A priest is somebody who is an intermediary directly to God, who is in the temple, who can perform magical kinds of feats like turning your sins, transferring your sins to an animal and having them consumed. Priests can do that, but rabbis are just regular human beings, just like all the rest of us. They just learned. They have studied Torah, the Bible, and through a great amount of study, they're respected in the community, and so rabbis are just the leaders of the religious community. In this new kind of Judaism, there's a strong emphasis on striving to understand and do something in the world to work towards making the world a better place. Faith plays an important role in Judaism, but it's quite different than the role that faith plays in a tradition like Christianity. In Christianity, one is supposed to be saved by faith, and faith alone in Protestant traditions. The Catholic tradition is somewhere in between, where faith and works are both important. In Judaism, the emphasis is strongly on works, and in order to do the right things, we need to understand what the right things are. We have, of course, the Torah, the first 5 books of the Bible, which are the most sacred, supposed to have been written by Moses with divine inspiration. But there are other books in the Hebrew Bible, which corresponds to the Christian Old Testament. And these are kind of like a divine letter that God has somehow brought into the world to provide some kind of guidance. But as should be pretty clear, the Bible doesn't tell us everything that we need to know. We have to interpret it. We have to understand it. And that's really at the forefront of what Judaism is all about. There's really no attempt to define some kind of an orthodox view. It's incumbent on each of us to work through the issues for ourselves and come up with the meaningful answers and live our lives accordingly. There is some idea of what might happen in the afterlife, but there's a much stronger emphasis on what we need to do while we're alive, with a basic belief that God will, in fact, do something when we die. But what that is exactly is really left a bit of an open question. There are some different theories, but there's just not a lot of discussion about that. Judaism primarily is focused on how do we understand the world, how do we live in the world, how do we make the world a better place. An example of that is going to be in this first reading that you'll find below, and that focuses on an idea called Tikun Olam, or repairing the world. And the idea goes back to the medieval period when it became popular to explore mystical dimensions of Judaism. And what came of that is a kind of third version of creation. Technically, of course, we've looked at 2 versions from Genesis already, but this new version, it doesn't really correspond to anything directly in the Bible. It goes something like this. When God wanted to create the world, he created 10 vessels, or sephirot. There's a picture of them on the screen if you look down. These vessels were meant to contain the divine energy that God was going to pour into these vessels. Let's think about them as like the structure of the world. And then God was going to, he built the structure, and then he was going to pour his divine energy or light into the structure. And it was like putting gas into an engine that you just built, and he gets ready to fire it up, but the divine light was too much, and the vessels shattered. And so the idea is that Jews are supposed to try and put the pieces of the world back together so that they can recreate the kind of divine world that God had intended. So read through this passage and see if you can see how it relates to the third version of creation that I just mentioned, and then we'll go on to different sections and explore how Jews have sought to understand what it means to be a human being and how we ought to live in the world.